All right, let's go. Number 12, Lascaux. There is a low limestone hill above the town of Montignac in the Dordogne Valley of southwestern France, with a steel door set into its slope. Behind the door is an airlock. Behind the airlock is a painted chamber roughly 17,000 years old, containing bulls, horses, stags, and a bear, laid down in charcoal and iron oxide by people whose names and language are gone. The cave was found in September 1940 by four teenagers following a dog into a hole left by a fallen tree. It was opened to the public in July 1948. 15 years later, the French state ordered it shut, and it has never reopened. The reason is written into the walls. When Lascaux was sealed by rockfall in the Paleolithic, its interior settled into an extremely stable climate, constant temperature, constant humidity, almost no air exchange. Opening the cave broke that stability. The entrance was widened. Sediment was removed from the floor without archaeological supervision. A stairway and concrete flooring were installed. Then came the visitors, in numbers nobody had modeled. By 1962, the cave was taking roughly 100,000 people a year, with peak days of around 1,800. Each person exhaled carbon dioxide and water vapor and carried in pollen and fungal spores on their shoes. The first warnings had appeared in 1955. By 1960, the curator, Max Saradet, was recording green spots spreading across the painted surfaces. The green was algae. A second problem followed, a white veil of calcite crystallizing over the pigment. The conservators called them the green sickness and the white sickness. In March 1963, the Minister of Cultural Affairs, André Malraux, appointed a scientific commission to examine the cave. On the 18th of April that year, he ordered the owner to close it. The algae were killed with antibiotics and diluted formalin. The calcite growth stopped spreading, but the crystal that had already formed could not be removed. Afterward, access was restricted to tiny groups for a few minutes at a time, walking through disinfectant, and later restricted further still. The detail that changes the story is the arithmetic. The paintings survived roughly 17,000 years in the dark. They came close to being destroyed in 15 years of electric light and breathing. Nothing in the cave had ever encountered a crowd. What was lethal was not vandalism or neglect. It was attention. Lascaux is now among the most closely guarded prehistoric sites on Earth. The cave was donated to the French state in 1972. Entry is by permit, restricted to conservation staff, and a small number of authorized researchers, monitored by sensors and cameras. Outbreaks have continued. In 2001, a white fungus spread through the entrance passages, and remediation campaigns have run in one form or another ever since. What the public sees instead are copies. Lascaux II opened in 1983. A larger facsimile, Lascaux IV, opened at Montignac in December 2016 and receives hundreds of thousands of visitors a year, none of whom are inside the cave. Lascaux was closed to save it, and the closure worked. It is also true that a government took a piece of the human past out of public view and has kept it there for 60 years. Preservation and concealment can produce the same result from the outside. The public gets a description of the thing rather than the thing. The hill above Montignac looks like any other hill. The door is closed. The bulls are still on the wall, in the dark, in the exact conditions that kept them for 17,000 years, and almost no living person will ever stand in front of them. Number 11, the burials that were given back. In the mid-1960s, an Australian anthropologist named Alan Thorne was working through the skeletal collections of the Museum of Victoria in Melbourne when he pulled out a box of cranial fragments. The bone was unusually thick. The brow was heavy. The vault was long and low, more archaic in appearance than anything he expected from a recent Australian burial. There was no proper site record attached to it. Thorne went looking for the paperwork. Tracing police and coroner reports from the Bendigo district, he established that the fragments had been turned up on the 1st of May 1962 by a bulldozer cutting an irrigation channel through a property at Cow Swamp, near Kahuna, in the central Murray Valley of northern Victoria. Between 1968 and 1972, Thorne excavated the site for the Australian National University. Working with the geologist Philip Macumber and with additional material recovered by a local resident, Gordon Spark, he documented the remains of at least 40 individuals. It was, and remains, the largest late Pleistocene cemetery known in Australia. Radiocarbon determinations placed most of the burials somewhere between roughly 13,000 and 9,000 years ago, with the youngest around 6,500. Grave goods were sparse. Some individuals had been buried with quartz flakes and bipolar cores. Some had been sprinkled with ochre. The bones themselves were the anomaly. The cow swamp crania were robust, thick-walled, with receding foreheads and heavy supraorbital ridges, and they sat outside the range of recent Aboriginal populations. Thorne argued that they represented a distinct, archaic-looking lineage, and used them to build a case that Australia had been settled by more than one founding population, one graceful and one robust. It was a direct challenge to the models of the day. The problem is that a second explanation fit the same bones. Don Brothwell, and later Peter Brown, argued that the long, low vaults at Cow Swamp were not an inherited archaic form at all, but the result of artificial cranial deformation, the deliberate binding of infants' heads. Brown found supporting evidence in related material from Kubul Creek and Nakuri. Thorne rejected the interpretation for the rest of his career. The dispute was never settled, and it was the kind of dispute that can only be settled by going back to the original specimens. In 1990, the Museum of Victoria returned the entire Cow Swamp collection, unconditionally, to the Aboriginal community at Echuca. The remains were reinterred. They are not available for study, and they will not be. The decision came out of a policy that had been building across Australia through the 1980s, and it rested on a claim that is difficult to argue with. These were graves, and the people in them had descendants who had never been asked. The same logic has since reshaped museum practice worldwide. It is also true that the reburial removed the largest Pleistocene skeletal sample on the continent from any future test, at the moment when methods were arriving that could have settled the question. What survives is a shelf of plaster. Casts of some of the cow swamp crania and mandibles are held in the archaeology department at the Australian National University, and copies of 2 of them were sent to the Natural History Museum in London and elsewhere. Everything now written about those 40 people is written from replicas. The originals are back in the ground beside the Murray, and the argument about who they were has no material left to feed on. Number 10. The cave with its door under the sea. In 1985, a professional diver named Henri Coscar, who ran a diving school out of Cassis on the Mediterranean coast of France, followed a tip about an opening in the rock below the Calanque de Morgiou, near Cap Morgiou, east of Marseille. The entrance sits about 37 meters beneath the surface. It is narrow, and the floor beyond it is covered in fine silt that clouds the water instantly if disturbed. Coscar went in. The passage runs upward for roughly 175 meters before surfacing in an air-filled chamber inside the headland. On his first entries, he saw nothing unusual. Diving lamps in the mid-1980s were not powerful, and the chamber is large. He returned over the following years, mapping the passage further each time. In July 1991, on a dive with Jan Goguen, Pascale Oriol, and his niece Sandrine Coscar, one of the party noticed the outline of a hand on the wall. It was a stencil, made by placing a hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it. Once they knew what to look for, more appeared. Coscar had kept the location largely to himself, in part to protect it. Rumors had spread anyway. On the 1st of September 1991, 3 divers became lost in the access gallery and drowned. Coscar and Goguen helped recover the bodies. 2 days later, he formally reported the cave to the authorities in Marseille. The prehistorians Jean Courtin and Jean Clot went in and authenticated it. What they found was more than 200 animal figures and around 65 hand stencils, executed in 2 distinct phases, dating roughly between 33,000 and 20,000 years ago. Horses, bison, ibex, aurochs, and a rare human-like figure. Some of the hand stencils show incomplete fingers. But here's where the story changes. Among the animals are seals and great auks and what appear to be other seabirds and fish. No other decorated cave in Europe has a marine bestiary like this. The explanation is geographic. At the time the paintings were made, the sea was as much as 120 meters lower than it is today, and the shoreline lay kilometers out from the modern coast. The cave was not a sea cave. It stood at the foot of a ravine, above a wide, cold, open plain, and the people who painted in it were looking at a coastline that no longer exists. That coastline is what drowned the cave. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the rising Mediterranean flooded the entrance and pushed up through the gallery. 4/5 of the cave, including a large proportion of the art that was once on its walls, is now submerged or destroyed. The French state closed the site. The entrance was fitted with a barrier, and access is restricted to authorized scientific teams. Archaeological missions ran from 2001 to 2015, cataloging and photographing what remains. In 2011, the researchers Luc Van Rel and Michael Olive raised an alarm. Measured sea level rise inside the cave was damaging images that had survived the first flooding, and the loss was accelerating. A full-scale replica, Coscar Mediterranee, opened in Marseille in 2022 so that the public could see something. The original is 37 meters down behind a grill, sealed by the state in a chamber where the water rises a little each decade. The paintings are being erased in a room no one is allowed to enter. Number 9. The riverbank that was buried twice. On the 28th of July, 1996, two young men were wading through the shallows of the Columbia River at Columbia Park in Kennewick, Washington, working their way toward the hydroplane races. One of them found a rounded object underfoot. It had eye sockets. By that evening, the Benton County coroner had the skull, and an archaeologist working under contract, James Chatters, had been called in. Over the following weeks, under a permit issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which controlled the land, Chatters recovered a nearly complete skeleton eroding out of the reservoir bank. The individual was male, of late middle age, around 170 centimeters tall, with healed fractures in at least 6 ribs. Embedded in the right hip, grown over by bone, was a gray object that turned out to be a stone, projectile point. A bone sample was sent for radiocarbon dating. It came back at more than 8,000 years. That single number turned an unusual find into one of the most contested skeletons in North America. The Corps immediately claimed authority over the remains, ordered scientific study to stop, and moved toward returning them under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. The coroner disputed jurisdiction. The bones were locked in an evidence locker at the sheriff's office. 8 scientists, including Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian, sued for access. Tribes of the Columbia Plateau, who called the man the Ancient One, held that he was an ancestor whose grave had been disturbed, and that further study was desecration. Then, the ground itself was taken out of the argument. In the spring of 1998, the Corps covered the discovery site, laying down hundreds of tons of rock and fill to bring the bank back up to the level of the original terrace and planting trees on top. The agency described the work as erosion control and denied any connection to the litigation. Whatever the intent, the effect was unambiguous. The stratigraphy that could have shown how the body came to be in that terrace and what else was in it was buried under riprap and root systems. It has never been excavated. The legal fight ran for years. In 2004, the Ninth Circuit ruled that the remains were not demonstrably affiliated with any living tribe under the statute, and study proceeded. Then, in 2015, a team led by S.K. Villerslev sequenced the genome. The result was clear. The closest living relatives of the Kennewick skeleton are Native Americans, and among the tested groups, the Colville were among the nearest. The scientific question that had justified 19 years of custody had been answered by a technique that barely existed when the skull came out of the water. In the intervening years, the skeleton had been examined in unusual depth. The volume assembled by Owsley and Richard Jantz described a powerfully built man with heavy muscle, attachments in the right arm, consistent with a lifetime of throwing, and a stable isotope signature, indicating a diet dominated by marine mammals rather than river fish. The reading offered was that he had spent much of his life on a coast and had come inland late. That interpretation is contested, as almost everything about this skeleton has been, and it can no longer be checked against the bone. Congress passed legislation directing the return of the remains. In February 2017, the ancient one was reburied by a coalition of Columbia Basin tribes at a location that has not been made public. The projectile point is still in his hip, in the images and scans taken before reburial. It was fired at him roughly 2 decades before he died, and he healed around it. The riverbank where he surfaced is a smooth, tree-planted slope of imported rock, and the ground that held him for 8,500 years is now a place that cannot be read. Number 8. Hueyatlaco. For most of the 20th century, the settlement of the Americas was treated as a late event. The dominant model placed the first widespread human presence somewhere between 13 and 16,000 years ago, arriving from Northeast Asia. Sites claiming greater antiquity were examined, and almost all failed on inspection. Reworked sediments, intrusive artifacts, misidentified stones. Then there is a gully in the Valsequillo Basin, south of Puebla in central Mexico. The site was found by a local amateur, Juan Armenta Camacho, and excavated from 1962 by the American archaeologist Cynthia Irwin Williams. The deposits held butchered animal bone, including extinct megafauna and stone tools. The tools were not crude. They included bifacially worked blades, scrapers, and projectile points on materials brought in from elsewhere, in stratified layers rather than surface scatters. The dating is where it stops being an ordinary site. Uranium series measurements on bone from the artifact-bearing layers, published in 1969 by Barney Sabo with Harold Malda and Irwin Williams, returned ages in the range of 2 to 300,000 years. Everyone involved treated this as a probable error. Further work was commissioned to resolve it. Virginia Steen McIntyre, then a graduate student, applied tetrahydration dating to the volcanic ash layers bracketing the deposits, with Malda and the geologist, Roald Freichsel. Fission track and mineral weathering measurements were added. The geological methods converged on roughly 250,000 years. What makes this difficult is that the results were internally consistent, and the implications were impossible. If the geology was right, someone was making sophisticated bifacial tools in central Mexico long before comparable technology appears anywhere in the Old World, and long before our species is thought to have existed at all. The team broke apart over it. In their 1981 paper in Quaternary Research, Steen McIntyre, Freichsel, and Malda laid out the evidence and stated the dilemma openly, noting that their colleague Irwin Williams considered an age of 250,000 years essentially impossible. Irwin Williams favored something nearer 20,000 years, itself controversial, and, according to later commentators, not well supported by anything the excavation had produced. The consequences were institutional, rather than dramatic. Publication stalled. Steen McIntyre could not write the dissertation she had planned and had to change her subject to volcanic ash dating in general. Funding for the site dried up. Irwin Williams, who had led the excavation, never published a final report. A manuscript remained unpublished at her death. Steen McIntyre has spent decades arguing that her career was damaged by the association, and Hueyatlaco is now routinely cited as a case of suppressed evidence. The record supports something more ordinary and, in its own way, more troubling. There is no documented order from any agency to bury the results. What there is instead is a disagreement between colleagues that became unresolvable, a lead excavator who withheld a final report, journals that lost interest, and a site that was allowed to degrade while the argument went cold. The most likely explanation for the dates remains contamination or the reworking of older material into younger deposits, and mainstream archaeology has never accepted the site. That explanation has also never been demonstrated at Hueyatlaco itself. The gully is still there in the Valsequillo Basin, cut and eroded, its upper deposits disturbed. The artifacts sit in storage. The one document that could have settled what was actually found in those layers, the final excavation report, was never written, and the person who could have written it is dead. Number 7. Amchitka. At 11 in the morning on the 6th of November, 1971, a 5-megaton thermonuclear device detonated in a shaft nearly 1,800 meters beneath a treeless island in the Western Aleutians. It remains the largest underground nuclear test ever conducted by the United States. The ground surface lifted and dropped by around 6 meters. Cliffs collapsed into the sea. The shock registered around magnitude 7. A cavity and a collapsed chimney formed in the rock below, and a new lake formed above it. Amchitka is about 68 kilometers long and no more than a few kilometers wide, part of the Rat Islands group, roughly 2,000 kilometers from Anchorage and considerably closer to Kamchatka. It is volcanic, tectonically unstable, treeless, and almost permanently overcast. It is also an ancestral home of the Unangaks, who occupied it intermittently from about 4,000 years ago until the late 18th century, when Russian fur traders arrived and the population was displaced and destroyed by violence and introduced disease. The island has had no permanent residents since 1832. That absence is what made it useful. The Aleutians had been set aside as a reservation by executive order in 1913, with wording that did not prevent military use. Amchitka became an American airfield during the Aleutian campaign of the Second World War. In the 1960s, the Atomic Energy Commission selected it for tests too large to be conducted in Nevada. Longshot, 80 kilotons, was detonated in 1965 to study how underground blasts could be distinguished from earthquakes. Milrow, about a megaton, followed in 1969 as a calibration shot to establish whether the island could contain something larger. Cannikin was the answer to that question. What makes this significant is not the size of the blast. It is what was on the surface above it. The coasts of Amchitka are lined with archaeological sites, semi-subterranean house depressions, shell middens, hunting camps, burial features. Because the island was federal land scheduled for destruction, the Atomic Energy Commission funded archaeology ahead of the tests. Contract crews working through Archaeological Research, Incorporated, surveyed and excavated through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and their findings were issued as a series of progress reports by Richard Sense and Roger de Sottles. Amchitka became one of the most intensively investigated islands in the Rat Group. That is the uncomfortable part of the record. A large share of what is known about 4,000 years of human occupation in that stretch of the Aleutians was recovered specifically because a government intended to detonate a 5-megaton warhead underneath it. The archaeology was not suppressed. It was salvage, performed on a deadline set by a weapons program, and it was buried inside technical reporting that almost no one outside the program read. There is an older layer to the same pattern. In June 1942, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska in the Western Aleutians. The United States responded by removing the Unangaks from their villages across the chain and holding them in disused canneries and camps in southeast Alaska, in conditions that killed roughly 1 in 10 of them over the following years. Some villages were burned by American forces to deny them to the enemy. When the survivors were returned, several communities were never reestablished. The islands that the Atomic Energy Commission later described as uninhabited had been emptied in living memory. The tests were fought. Aleut plaintiffs sued to stop Cannikin. Environmental groups joined them, and the campaign against the test produced the organization that became Greenpeace. A divided Supreme Court declined to block the detonation, and it went ahead on schedule. Amchitka is closed now. It sits inside the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, monitored by the Department of Energy for radionuclides leaking from cavities that will remain hazardous far longer than any institution that made them. The artifacts from those salvage seasons are in museum trays in Alaska, cataloged and stable. The villages they came from are still on the coast, under grass, above a chamber of fused rock. Number 6. The mummies that were sent home early. In late January 2011, a crate sat unopened at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. Inside it was a woman who had been dead for roughly 3,800 years. She is known as the Beauty of Xiaohe. She was recovered from Cemetery 5 at Jiaohe in the Tarim Basin of what is now the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, from a boat-shaped coffin covered with cattle hide and marked by a wooden oar. The saline, arid soil desiccated her rather than decaying her. She wears a large white felt hat and a woven wool wrap. Her eyelashes are intact. The cemetery she came from is one of the strangest burial grounds in Asia. It is a sand mound bristling with more than 140 upright wooden posts, some of them shaped, standing over layers of boat-shaped coffins stacked one generation on top of another. It was located in 1934 by the Swedish archaeologist Folke Bergman, guided by a local hunter named Ordek, and then effectively lost for the rest of the century in a desert that swallows landmarks. Chinese archaeologists relocated it in 2000 and excavated through the following decade. The exhibition that carried her, Secrets of the Silk Road, had already run in Santa Ana, California, and in Houston without incident. Philadelphia was the last stop. Days before the opening, Chinese authorities declined to authorize the unpacking of the mummies and the associated artifacts. The show opened on the 5th of February 2011 with life-size photographs and wooden models standing in for the bodies. After negotiations, in which the Penn scholar Victor Mayer argued the museum's case directly, limited permission was granted. The artifacts went on display on the 18th of February. The mummies were required to leave on the 15th of March, months before the exhibition closed. A Chinese embassy spokesman said the Philadelphia venue had not been part of the original agreement. Meyer described the episode as a bureaucratic disaster and said he understood the real reasons, but could not discuss them while the show was running. What makes these particular bodies political is not their age. It is their appearance and their location. The Tarim mummies have long hair, some of it light, prominent noses, and textiles woven in twill patterns that reminded early observers of European cloth. They come from a region where the question of who arrived first is not academic. Uyghur nationalists have adopted figures such as the Beauty of Lula as ancestral. Chinese state history emphasizes long continuity. Bodies that photograph as visibly non-Chinese and predate the Silk Road by 2,000 years do not fit comfortably into either account. Then the genomes came back. In 2021, a team drawn from Jilin University, the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology, and Paleoanthropology in Beijing, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, Seoul National University, and Harvard published genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest Tarim individuals, dating to roughly 2100 to 1700 BC, together with 5 earlier individuals from the Dzungarian Basin to the north. The Tarim people were not migrants from the west. They carried no detectable Western steppe ancestry at all. They were direct descendants of the ancient North Eurasians, a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer population that had largely vanished by the end of the last ice age and survives elsewhere only in fractions, highest in indigenous Siberians and Native Americans. Roughly 70% of the Tarim genome came from that source, the remainder from ancient Northeast Asians. They were, genetically, a relict population that had been sitting in the basin the whole time. They were not isolated in any other sense. Dental calculus from Xiaohe preserved milk proteins, showing dairy pastoralism from the founding of the site. They took cattle, sheep, wheat, and dairying from their neighbors and kept their own bloodline and their own burial practice. The answer served no one's argument. The mummies were not European settlers, and they were not Han pioneers. They were the last of a people with no surviving descendants under any modern name, buried under wooden oars in a lake basin that has since become desert. The Beauty of Xiaohe went back to Urumqi in March 2011, and she has not traveled since. Number 5. the archaeology that traveled with an army. In the autumn of 1939, in newly occupied Poland, a group of German academics began moving through museum collections with military escort. Among them was the prehistorian Peter Paulsen, working for an organization called the Ahnenerbe. The Warsaw Archaeological Museum was stripped when the occupation's civil administration issued an order in November 1939 prohibiting the unapproved export of Polish items. One of Paulsen's colleagues, Hans Schlief, arranged for 5 freight cars of material to be shipped to Poznan, which lay outside that administration's jurisdiction. Schlief was subsequently given a trusteeship. The Ahnenerbe had been founded in 1935 and was absorbed into Heinrich Himmler's SS, with Wolfram Sievers as its managing director. Its stated purpose was research into Germanic ancestry. Its actual function was to produce a usable prehistory, evidence that Germanic peoples had been present, dominant, and civilized in whatever territory the state intended to claim. It ran excavations, expeditions, anthropometric surveys, and publications, and it competed with rival Nazi institutions for control of the discipline. This is what happens when a government does not merely restrict archaeology, but takes ownership of the questions. The organization's reach was wide and uneven. It funded excavations at sites across Germany and the occupied territories, chosen less for what they promised archaeologically than for what they might be made to say. It ran a rune and symbol research department, a folklore section, and expeditions abroad. Between 1938 and 1939, it sent the zoologist Ernst Schaefer to Tibet, accompanied by the anthropologist Bruno Beger, who measured the heads, faces, and limbs of hundreds of people and took plaster casts of their features in an attempt to place them within a racial scheme drawn up in advance. The expedition returned with genuine zoological and botanical collections, and with anthropometric data gathered to prove a conclusion that had already been written. That is the recurring shape of Ahnenerbe fieldwork: real technique, real excavation, and a question the state had already answered. In July 1942, after German forces took the Crimea, Himmler dispatched Herbert Jenken to the peninsula. Jenken was not a crank. He had directed the excavations at Hedeby, the great Viking Age trading settlement in Schleswig, and his fieldwork there was serious. He arrived in Crimea with the Bronze Age specialist Karl Kirsten and the Russian-speaking Baron Wolf von Seefeld, tasked with documenting a Gothic past for a region that the SS planned to clear of its existing population and resettle with Germans. The team's methods followed the front line. Janken met officers of Einsatzkommando 11, part of Einsatzgruppe D, and received information on Crimean museum holdings from its commander, Otto Ohlendorf, who would later be tried and executed for the mass murders his unit carried out. Finding that the major collections had already been evacuated eastward by Soviet authorities, the team traveled with the 5th SS Panzer Division as it advanced, reaching Maykop in the northern Caucasus in August. Himmler sent instructions to investigate the fortress of Mangup in the Crimean highlands as a possible Gothic residence. The problem is that they found nothing. There was no Gothic empire waiting in the ground to justify a resettlement program. The artifacts they wanted had been removed. The evidence they were sent to produce did not exist, and the campaign in the East collapsed before the question could be forced any further. What the operation did accomplish was subtraction. Collections were moved, split, and in some cases lost outright. Excavation records vanished. Contexts that had taken decades to assemble were disassembled in weeks. Museums in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia still carry inventory numbers with nothing attached to them, and objects surface periodically in private hands with no provenance beyond the war. There is a final detail worth stating plainly. Herbert Jenken was cleared on appeal at his denazification trial in 1949. He was reinstated, held a chair at Göttingen, and became one of the most influential archaeologists in post-war Germany, dying in 1990. The discipline absorbed him. What it never recovered was the material. Number 4. The laboratory that went looking for older viruses. In the Sakha Republic, in northeastern Siberia, the permafrost is failing. Thaw slumps are opening across the region, some of them a kilometer wide, exposing ground that has been continuously frozen since the Pleistocene. Out of those exposures come carcasses, horses, wolves, cave lions, bison, mammoths, some with hide, hair, stomach contents, and soft tissue preserved well enough to sample. One of them was a horse recovered in 2009, at least 4,500 years old, with intact internal tissue. On the 16th of February 2021, the Russian state laboratory known as Vector announced that it had begun extracting and analyzing viruses from that horse. Vector is the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology at Koltsovo in the Novosibirsk region, operating under the federal agency Rospotrebnadzor. The project was described as the beginning of paleovirology in Russia, run in collaboration with the University at Yakutsk. Maxim Cheprasov, who heads the Mammoth Museum laboratory there, noted that the recovered animals had been examined for bacteria before, but that studies of ancient viruses were a first. The program was to extend to mammoths, elk, dogs, hares, rodents, and partridges. The institution matters here. Vector was a principal facility of the Soviet biological weapons program, and it is one of only 2 declared repositories in the world of live variola virus, the agent of smallpox. It holds containment laboratories at the highest biosafety levels. Its Soviet history was concealed for decades and became public knowledge only after defections in the early 1990s. The underlying science is legitimate, and it is not new. In 2014, Jean-Michel Claverie and Chantal Abergel, working with Russian colleagues, revived a giant virus from a Siberian permafrost core, taken roughly 30 meters below the surface and dated to around 30,000 years. They named it Pithovirus sibericum. It is large enough to see under a light microscope, carries around 500 genes, and after 30 millennia in frozen ground, it was still able to infect an amoeba. The team used amoeba deliberately as a safe bait and verified that the viruses recovered could not infect animal or human cells. In 2023, the same group reported additional strains from 7 Siberian locations, the oldest around 48,500 years. What makes this uncomfortable is not the virus that has been found. It is the ground it came out of. The realistic hazard is not a resurrected Pleistocene plague. It is smaller, more ordinary, and already documented. In the summer of 2016, on the Yamal Peninsula, an unusually hot season thawed ground containing the carcasses of reindeer that had died in an anthrax outbreak decades earlier. Anthrax spores are exceptionally durable. Thousands of reindeer died. Dozens of people were hospitalized, and a child died. The pathogen did not need to be exotic. It only needed to be preserved. There is a second documented case that sits closer to the question people actually mean when they ask, what is in the ice? In 2012, a French and Russian team led by Philippe Biagini reported the identification of variola DNA, the agent of smallpox, in the tissue of a woman buried in a frozen wooden grave at a site in the Churupcha area of Yakutia in the late 17th or early 18th century. The grave held 5 bodies, unusual in a region where individual burial was standard, and the arrangement suggested they had been interred quickly. The genetic material was heavily fragmented. No infectious virus was recovered, and none was expected. What the study demonstrated was narrower and still significant. Frozen bodies in the Siberian permafrost are an archive of pathogen DNA, and the lineage recovered from that grave sat outside both modern smallpox clades. Beneath that sits a harder problem: thawing permafrost, expanding resource extraction in the Arctic, and a small number of high-containment laboratories with opaque institutional histories now intersect in the same territory, and no external body has the access required to audit what is being recovered or what is being kept. The published work is careful. The published work is not the whole picture, and no one outside those institutions can say how large the remainder is. The frozen ground of northern Siberia holds an unsampled biological archive tens of thousands of years deep. It is being opened by the weather rather than by permission, and the first organizations reaching into it are the ones already positioned there. Number 3. The skull that was hidden from a government. In 1933, A Chinese laborer was working on the construction of a bridge over the Songhua River at Harbin, in the far northeast of China. The region was under Japanese occupation, administered as the puppet state of Manchukuo, and the work crew was under Japanese supervision. Somewhere in the river mud, according to the account his family later gave, he found a human skull. It was nearly complete, heavy, with a single upper molar still seated in the bone. He did not hand it to his supervisor. He carried it home and lowered it into an abandoned well, a traditional method of concealing something valuable, and he left it there. He never went back for it. Manchukuo fell. The Second World War ended. The Civil War came and went, and he returned to farming through the decades that followed. He said nothing about the well until shortly before his death, when he told his family what was in it. In 2018, they recovered the cranium and delivered it to Jiqiang at Hebei Geo University. The details of that story rest on family testimony reported by the research team and cannot be independently confirmed. What can be confirmed is the object. The Harbin cranium is one of the most complete archaic human skulls ever found. It has a long, low brain case, a massive continuous brow ridge, broad squared eye sockets, an exceptionally wide face, and very large molars, combined with relatively flat cheekbones that look more like our own. Its endocranial volume falls within the modern human range. Geochemical analysis of the bone and of adhering sediment indicated an age of at least 146,000 years. In 2021, a team including Ni Shijun, Ji Qiang, and Chris Stringer published a description and proposed a new species, Homo longi, the Dragon River human, after the Heilongjiang province where it was found. Others were unconvinced by the new name, and the fossil sat in the middle of a widening problem, a growing set of Middle Pleistocene Asian skulls that fit no existing category cleanly. Then, the proteins came back. In June 2025, a group led by Chaomei Fu at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology reported ancient proteins recovered from the petrous bone of the inner ear, 95 proteins in total, from more than 20,000 identified peptides. The variants matched Denisovans. A second line of evidence produced mitochondrial DNA from hardened dental plaque on the surviving tooth, pointing the same way. To understand why that mattered, it helps to know how thin the Denisovan record was. The population was identified in 2010 not from anatomy, but from genetics, when a laboratory in Leipzig sequenced DNA from the fragment of a girl's finger bone excavated in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The bone was smaller than a fingernail. The sequence did not match Neanderthals and did not match us. Everything added since has been comparably small. A handful of molars from the same cave, a mandible recovered from Baixia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, and assigned by protein analysis in 2019, a rib from the same site, and DNA extracted directly from cave sediments where no bone survived at all. So, Denisovans were known for 15 years almost entirely from fragments. There was no skull, and therefore no face. The Harbin cranium, if the identification holds, supplies one. Not everyone accepts it. Ni Sijun, who worked on the original description, has publicly questioned the DNA extraction methods used, and the naming dispute continues. The wider point does not depend on the label. Denisovan ancestry is carried by living people today, in small percentages across East and Southeast Asia, and at its highest levels in Papuans and Aboriginal Australians. A variant inherited from Denisovans underlies high-altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations. This was never an extinct branch in the sense of vanishing without issue. It is inside a substantial fraction of the modern human species. The skull spent 85 years at the bottom of a well because a worker did not trust an occupying government with what he had pulled out of a river. That decision preserved it through an invasion, a civil war, the Cultural Revolution, and the later commercial fossil trade that has scattered so much Chinese material into private collections. The man who hid it died without knowing what it was. Number 2. The island where the mammoths did not die. Wrangel Island sits in the Arctic Ocean between the East Siberian and Chukchi Seas, north of the Chukotka coast, separated from the mainland by the Long Strait, which is about 140 kilometers wide and shallow. The island covers roughly 8,000 square kilometers of low mountains, plateaus, and tundra. It is treeless, fog-bound for much of the summer, and one of the densest polar bear denning grounds on Earth. The Soviet Union asserted sovereignty over it in 1926 and settled it, founding the village of Ushakovskoye, with Inuit families brought from Chukotka. In 1976, the island and its waters were made a state nature reserve, with access controlled by permit, in a militarized Arctic frontier that foreign scientists effectively could not enter. For most of the 20th century, whatever was on Wrangel Island was a Soviet matter. Mammoth remains had been noted there. Nobody expected them to be interesting. The extinction of the woolly mammoth across northern Eurasia was treated as settled. The populations collapsed at the end of the Pleistocene, and by around 9,500 years ago, the species was gone everywhere. Then the dates came back. Between 1989 and 1991, the zoologist Sergei Vartanyan collected tusks, teeth, and bones from across the island. The first 5 radiocarbon determinations, run in 1990 with the St. Petersburg laboratory of Hikmat Arslanov, all fell in the Holocene between roughly 7,400 and 4,700 years before present. Those are not Ice Age dates. Those are dates from the age of agriculture. Vartanyan continued sampling. The results held and were confirmed by parallel measurements in other laboratories using international control samples. In March 1993, he published with Vadim Garet and Andrei Scher in Nature. Mammoths had survived on Wrangel Island until approximately 4,000 years ago. The chronology is worth stating slowly. The last mammoths were alive, while the pyramids at Giza were standing and already old. They were alive after the Sarsen Circle at Stonehenge was raised. They outlasted their own species on the mainland by some 6,000 years, on a single island of tundra, eating steppe plants that had survived nowhere else in comparable form. The early reports described them as dwarfs. Later work revised that. The Wrangel animals were somewhat smaller than mainland mammoths, as island populations often become, but they were not a true dwarf form. The reason they lasted appears to be botanical. Wrangel is high enough and dry enough, with enough variation in slope and drainage, that fragments of the old mammoth steppes survived there. After the wet, mossy tundra had replaced it almost everywhere else on the Arctic mainland, the island preserved the grassland. The grassland preserved the animals. They were trapped there by water. Rising seas cut the land bridge across what is now the Long Strait, and a group of mammoths that happened to be on the high ground when it flooded became a closed population, roughly 140 kilometers from anywhere, on a landmass smaller than Crete. What ended them is the part that has not been settled. Genomic work, led by Love, Dalen, and colleagues, drawing on Vartanyan's material, shows that the founding population passed through a severe bottleneck around 6,000 years ago, perhaps a few individuals, and that the survivors carried an accumulating load of harmful mutations. That is a fragile population. It is not on the genetic evidence, a population in visible decline immediately before the end. The herd appears to have persisted at a low but steady size, and then stopped, quickly. Isotope work points the same way. A study by researchers from Helsinki, Tübingen, and the Russian Academy of Sciences, using carbon and nitrogen values from mammoth bone and drawing on Vartanyan's collections, found no sign that the animal's diet or their environment was deteriorating in the final centuries. The herd was not starving its way toward extinction. Something happened to it. Proposed triggers include an extreme icing event, in which freezing rain seals the forage under a crust the animals cannot break, a mechanism that still kills Arctic herbivores in large numbers. Human presence cannot be ruled out. The earliest archaeological evidence on the island, at the site of Chertov Ovrag, dates to a few centuries after the youngest known mammoth bone. Nobody has found a Wrangel mammoth kill site. The island is now a UNESCO World Heritage Property, still restricted, still difficult to reach. Tusks and molars continue to erode out of the tundra each thaw season. 6,000 years after the last mammoth on the continent had gone, a population of them was still walking across that ground, in a world that already had cities, writing and metal, and nobody who was building those cities ever knew. Number 1. The ice core that was forgotten in a freezer. In 1959, the United States Army began cutting tunnels into the Greenland ice sheet, about 240 kilometers inland from Thule. The installation was called Camp Century. It was a small town buried in snow. Laboratories, dormitories, a kitchen, a chapel, a hospital. 21 trenches roofed with steel arches and backfilled, all of it powered by a portable nuclear reactor lowered into the ice. The publicly stated purpose was Arctic research under polar conditions. That was true, and it was not the whole reason. Camp Century was also the proving ground for Project Iceworm, an Army plan to build a network of tunnels under the ice sheet in which hundreds of ballistic missiles could be moved between firing positions, invisible and untargetable. Greenland is Danish territory. Denmark, which had a standing policy against nuclear weapons on its land, was not told what the tunnels were for. Iceworm failed on physics. Ice does not hold still. The glacier deformed continuously, squeezing the trenches, cracking the roof arches, and requiring constant recutting. Engineers calculated that the tunnels would close faster than they could be maintained. The reactor was removed in 1964. The base was abandoned in 1967 and left where it was, along with its diesel, its wastewater, and its low-level radioactive residue, all of which the ice has since buried tens of meters deep. Before it closed, the camp did something that outlasted every part of its military purpose. In 1966, its scientists drilled through the entire thickness of the ice sheet, roughly 1,400 meters, recovering the first ice core in history, taken all the way to the bed. Then, they kept drilling, and pulled up about 3.5 meters of frozen sediment from underneath. The ice became foundational. Its oxygen isotope record was among the first direct archives of the planet's glacial cycles, and it shaped the entire field that followed. The sediment was another matter. Nobody at the time had a technique that could do much with a few meters of frozen mud. It was cut into chunks, put into glass jars, labeled as Camp Century sub-ice material, and set aside. Then it went missing. The core collection moved from an Army freezer to the university at Buffalo in the 1970s, and from Buffalo to a facility in Copenhagen in the 1990s. The sediment jars traveled with it and were not cataloged with the ice. For roughly a quarter of a century, nobody knew where they were. In 2017, during an inventory ahead of a move to a new freezer, the Danish ice core curator Jørgen Peter Steffensen recognized what was in the jars and contacted researchers who might want them. But here's where the story changes. In 2019 at the University of Vermont, Andrew Christ put the thawed sediment under a microscope expecting sand, gravel, and ground-up rock, the debris a glacier leaves at its base. What he found was twigs, moss, stems with leaves still attached, fragments of Arctic willow, fungal spores, not transported fragments smeared through glacial till, but a recognizable, delicate tundra ecosystem sitting directly beneath 1.5 miles of ice. The 2021 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Christ, Paul Bierman, and an international group laid out the case. The plant macrofossils and organic biomarkers came from at least 2 ice-free warm intervals. Oxygen isotope values in the ice filling the sediment's pores indicated precipitation falling at a much lower elevation than the present ice surface, which is only possible if the ice sheet was not there. Cosmogenic isotope ratios and luminescence measurements bracketed the burial. In 2023, a follow-up study in Science narrowed the timing. Luminescence dating placed one ice-free interval at around 416,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of roughly 38,000 years, during a long, moderate interglacial. At that time, northwestern Greenland, under what is now some of the thickest ice on the island, was open ground with vegetation on it. The assumption being overturned had been in place for decades, that the Greenland ice sheet, once established, had persisted more or less intact for 2.5 million years, through every warm period the Pleistocene produced. The Camp Century sediment says otherwise. The ice sheet has melted away from that location within the era of our own genus, and the melting happened under an atmosphere containing roughly 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. The current figure is above 420. The volume involved is not abstract. Enough of Greenland melted during that interval to raise global sea level by at least 1.5 meters, and possibly several meters. The coastlines that would be affected are the ones most of the world's population now lives on. There is a symmetry in this that is difficult to look away from. A government built a secret installation inside an ice sheet to hide weapons from an adversary, and concealed its purpose from the country that owned the ground. The scheme failed and was abandoned. The only thing of lasting value it produced was a tube of frozen mud that nobody wanted, which was mislaid for 25 years in a series of freezers, and which turned out to contain the single, most direct piece of evidence that the ice above it is not permanent. The leaves are real. They are small, brown, and intact enough to identify to genus, and they are now in laboratory storage several thousand kilometers from where they grew. Above them, Camp Century is still there, crushed flat, 30-odd meters down and sinking, waiting under a surface that has already vanished once. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.